The first slide that we have are the easy ones. I think we're going to pull them up here in a second. And basically what you highlight is just how much electricity is actually used. So just maybe help us understand, like it's not nearly as much electricity as most people think it is.
I mean, it's all relative, really, and so this is taken from a paper I wrote with NIDAG called Bitcoin Net Zero. And so we set out to sort of really robustly quantify the electricity consumption and also allow people to sort of give them the tools to predict the future electricity consumption. Because the only people that have done that historically have been like wacky academics that get the numbers wrong by like a factor of 1,000. So like there's this one paper from the University of Hawaii in 2018 that said Bitcoin was going to warm the earth by 2 degrees.
We appreciate your confidence in us, but we're not that good.
I know they really Bitcoin maximalists to the core, right? And their model was premised on Bitcoin having this per transaction electricity cost, which is not how it works.
Yep.
And also on Bitcoin transactions scaling up to hundreds and hundreds of billions per year. Also not really possible. So we want to present alternative models that actually make sense.
Okay, so we have that first one that if we pull it up here, it's simply just explaining that it's only 0.2% of all global electricity generation, and it's 0.04% of global primary energy consumption. What's the difference between global primary energy consumption and global electricity generation?
So the world produces a lot more energy than it does electricity because there are non-electric sources of energy like combusting fuels for transport. And heating stoves that you might be burning firewood or coal or something like that. And so the amount of energy we produce actually outstrips electricity. So I don't know, it's sort of up to you what you want to compare it to, whether you want to compare it to the electricity that's produced on grid or like the total, energy this world is producing, which is a lot. But either way, I think it's relatively minimal for a monetary system that stores, $1 trillion as of today and settles, tens of billions of dollars a day.
So really, it's small regardless.
It just depends what you want to compare it to. And I don't think the country level comparisons make any sense because most of the countries Bitcoin is typically compared to are like small, like pretty agrarian countries that like exported their industrial sector to places like China. And so given that we live in a globalized economy, no one country, if you look within their geographic borders, the like emissions factor of their GDP, a lot of that's going to be externalized to like industrial centers like China, right? So what you should be doing is just looking at the industrial impact of like whole industries. And so that's another thing we did in the paper is we compared Bitcoin to certain industries, certain sources of load, certain metal extraction. So we found that it was kind of in the same universe as zinc extraction.
We have that slide. Next slide. Yeah, look at this. Yeah, I think we got that one. So I came prepared.
Finally,
once.
Has anyone ever protested over like the electricity associated with zinc extraction?
Somebody somewhere probably once, but that's it.
You know what? Stupid question. I'm sure someone's upset about it.
Stop the zinc manufacturers.
I mean, to be clear, zinc is a great metal. Like supplementing zinc is like a good idea in my opinion. But I don't see anyone getting like apoplectically upset about it. And then, of course, Bitcoin is actually generally less than gold, kind of probably less than copper, the emissions. And then, of course, aluminum and steel are like massive. But yeah, so like it compares with kind of like niche metal extraction. So it kind of is what it is.
Okay, if we go to the next slide here, we have this idea that it's not digital gold, in your opinion, digital aluminum. So explain this.
Yeah, so I don't know if, have you guys visited any of the big Bitcoin plants?
No.
There's one in Rockdale, Texas, which is a really big one. And then there's this other one I have a picture here is in Messina, New York on the St. Lawrence River, upstate New York. It's hard to get to. We like chartered a little plane to get there. Those are former Alcoa smelting plants. And aluminum, has the highest embodied energy in the refining of the product of any metal. So for whatever reason, smelting bauxite and turning it into aluminum takes a ton of electricity. And so because of that, you had the smelters would actually go to locations with really abundant energy. So they would kind of chase the energy. And so that's why you'd end up with plants in like upstate New York and things like that with abundant hydropower. And aluminum ended up being this way to export energy through the commodity. And now the amazing historical parallels, the Bitcoin is kind of like that. Bitcoin mines are now taking up residence in these old smelting plants. And so, I just really like that historical parallel. Like aluminum used to be this way to soak up excess energy. Now Bitcoin does that.
Yeah. And Bitcoin does it better.
Much more efficiently because Bitcoin's modular. Yep. You can have one shipping container with 500 ASICs out there on the oil field, soaking up excess wasted gas. You can obviously do it with hydro. You can, and you can interrupt the process, which is very important. We'll get into that. So yeah, it's just as a synthetic metal, basically, it does it in this sort of like highly efficient, highly granular way.
Next slide. And then it's big. Like people don't realize how big it is. And actually, I think this number has been growing pretty rapidly, right? In terms of how much people are actually being paid to secure the network right now.
It's bigger than this already. I made these slides, $10,000 ago. Yeah, it's a big industry though, for sure.
So right now, if I just look quickly, approximately $52 million over the last couple of days is the mining reward that globally is being paid out. For those that don't understand or don't know what that means, the Bitcoin block subsidy, the thing that is given to miners every 10 minutes or so in exchange for them helping to secure the network, there's adds up to 900 Bitcoin per day. You take the 900 Bitcoin per day and you multiply it by the price. And so over the last 24 hours, that's $52.6 million. According to casebitcoin.com. All right, let's go to the next slide. By the way, your title today on the show is the most violent man in Bitcoin.
That's apt. I really need to live up to that.
Do it when you leave here. Don't be violent right now, other than with your words. All right, so with this, I've now seen multiple differences in this chart. We don't have the other one, but there's a chart that just came out that shows that the U.S. took majority of the market share and China has zero. We can talk about why. Maybe China doesn't have zero. But definitely U.S. has gained a ton of market share. China has lost a ton.
I know, and my regret is that I gave this presentation a week before the new Cambridge data dropped, so I have the old chart on here. But yeah, suffice to say, the U.S. is 35% of the network. Today, according to Cambridge, China is apparently zero. Not actually zero.
Cambridge couldn't wait to wipe them out. Cambridge's like, oh, China's zero.
Yeah, you're out of here. Yes, so China's not actually zero, but yeah, as I was pointing out here, look, Bitcoin mining, U.S. is the #1 country in the world. We knew this even before the Cambridge data dropped. Mm-hmm. Now we know it for sure. #1 country in the world for Bitcoin mining. That's a good thing.
Before the China ban of miners in May, I think it was, what was the split between the U.S. and China? Do we remember in terms of what the U.S. market share was at the time?
I mean, it's on here, the historicals. I mean, the U.S. was single digits for a long time.
Okay.
Right? So very, very much not material. China just dominated. They had, 60, 70%, yeah. Market share. And the U.S. was, for a long time, under 10%.
Okay. Today, U.S. has 35%, which is the most out of anyone. So it doesn't mean that the United States has majority. It just means that no other country has more than the United States. U.S. is at 35%. Now, the two things that you call out here that I think is really interesting. One is the new ASIC deliveries. And what I want you to explain is, I don't think people understand the lead time for the machines and how basically when somebody makes an order, you know where those machines are going. And so you can start to forecast out a little bit of where hash rate's going to come online, 3, 4, 6 months, whatever it takes for them to actually plug the machines in.
Yeah, so knowing a little bit about what the miners are doing, you can forecast the hash rate of the Bitcoin network in 12 months' time, and you can forecast where mining will occur because the miners like to, announce that they've bought X many units, and that's promotional for them. So you just have to stitch all those little pieces of data together and you get a sense for where the Bitcoin network will be in 12, 24 months time. Obviously there's some uncertainty in there. So basically, a lot of I think the best projections I've seen have the Bitcoin network being at 300 exahashes by the end of next year.
By the end of next year. So and right now we're at like what, 140?
150-ish, okay. Yeah, so doubling at least, but north of 300. If you looked at where the new machines were going, they were all been bought by U.S. buyers, and a lot of the buyers are public companies, so they're providing those disclosures on an ongoing basis. We also know what installations they're building in terms of megawatts. So we can get a pretty good sense of where, the industry is going to be in a year's time. And it's the build out is happening in the US.
Where are they buying most of the machines from? Is it still Bitmain, or are there other players that are now big suppliers?
Bitmain and WhatsMiner, MicroBT are the two big ones.
Okay. And of those, neither one are based in the United States. Do we have concerns that there is no actual like fabrication done in the United States for the machines?
Yeah, I think that's a concern. The foundries are in, I want to say, Korea and Taiwan. Obviously, that's a big geopolitical question. If Taiwan is going to stay independent, there is a foundry being built by TSMC in Austin, I believe. And so they're trying to diversify away. I think they understand the writing's on the wall with Taiwan. They want to kind of ship a lot of that over. It's going to take a while, though.
Yeah. And I guess part of this is if you can get a fabrication facility built in the United States, you can serve U.S. customers. There's all kinds of logistics that get solved there. But really, it's probably the geopolitical risk that they're solving for.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more important things than making Bitcoin chips, like GPUs. I mean, it just like it's a critical industry. The U.S. just doesn't have a homegrown one right now.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is the United States and in Texas. Now, I'll let you defend yourself, but I don't want you pandering to Texas because you're not in Texas anymore. If you were giving this presentation at the Texas Blockchain Summit, I'm assuming that they were expecting you to say nice things about Texas. But explain why Texas is so interesting.
Well, yeah, this is a Texas. That was the topic they asked me to talk about. So I wasn't going to talk about Bitcoin mining in Florida. So. There isn't a lot.
When I saw this, I literally I saw somebody responded online, and they were like, "Oh, Dan, Texas is going to be huge." I was like, "Well, yeah." But this is also a Texas-specific conference.
Look, let's not write Miami and Florida off. We can still win this. Okay, we have currently approximately zero amount of mining here in the great state of Florida,
and Texas has a lot.
They have a huge amount. I mean, I think it's probably close to 1 gigawatt. Keep in mind, the whole Bitcoin network is approximately 10 gigawatts of power.
So 1/10 of the entire network is in Texas right now. We think.
Now that might be an aggressive assumption, but there's a huge amount of build out happening in Texas right now, in particular West Texas, where there's an enormous amount of renewables. And like the amount of renewables that are coming onto the grid in the coming years in Texas is unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. The Texas grid, I think, is around 80 gigawatts, ERCOT. And you're looking at, maybe 20, 30 gigawatts of wind and solar just in the next 2 years.
You think that 25 to let's call it 40% of the Texas grid is going to be used for Bitcoin mining?
Oh, no.
Or is this net new addition?
Yeah, those are new renewables. My projection is like 2 to 3 gigs for Bitcoin mining in Texas by the end of next year.
Got it.
Which I think is actually reasonably conservative based on what's happening. But yeah, I mean, so that would be, 5-ish% of the grid maybe.
Wow. That's still a lot.
It's helpful though. It's a very interesting source of load. It's a very kind of unique and different source of load. So there's nuances there.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. I feel like we're playing a game of like, what's next? Because I forget what we put in here. Okay. All right. So it's becoming the heartland of U.S. mining. Let's go to maybe the next one. And then this is how they're aggressively expanding. Now, most of this is coming from publicly traded disclosures.
Yeah, a lot of these are public companies. Not all of them are. Blockstream's not public. But yeah, Core Size about to go public with a little SPAC. Probably the biggest. They'll be the biggest publicly traded miner in the U.S. Riot is active in Texas. They're pretty big. Compute North is building down there in Texas. I mean, like there's just a huge amount of activity in the U.S. right now. If you're using modern hardware, you're mining your coins at like $5,000 to $10,000 right now. You sell the coin at $58,000. So
you think that's the price of sophisticated miners is $5,000 to $10,000, depending on the energy cost and labor cost and what you bought your machines at.
Yeah, but keep in mind you have to depreciate the value of the hardware. I mean, you have to include the amortization of buying the S19s and things like that. But yeah, like just on the pure. I mean,
even if that doubles the price of the Bitcoin, including every single thing you possibly could, and now you're mining at 25,000, you're still selling it at 58,000.
Yeah, the margins are obscene for miners right now. It's unreal. And, the China crackdown created a huge kind of surplus for the U.S. miners. China gave a subsidy to U.S. miners because it's a single market.
Yeah.
It's not like some commodities where they sell for different prices. Like natural gas in the U.S. is much cheaper than natural gas in Japan. But Bitcoin sells for a single global price. And so if one country bans the mining activity, that's a subsidy to the miners elsewhere. It's incredible.
So this is really interesting to me. What you're explicitly talking about is that China shut down mining in their country, and that kicked off, I don't know, let's say 90 to 95% of all the miners in the country. When they did that, we saw hash rate go down, I think more than 50% is when it bottomed.
Yeah.
And they had to literally unplug their machines, move elsewhere. We, at that time, saw a bunch flow to the United States, also elsewhere, but the United States was definitely the biggest winner from that. When you get that drop in hash rate, the difficulty adjustment was it was pretty breathtaking just how quickly it recovered and was able to kind of withstand what many people would think of a normal computer system could potentially be fatal, right? If 50 to 70% of all of your computing power went offline in pretty much a moment's notice, there's not many systems that are just chilling, right? And so the mining difficulty, what did that do to the profit margins of US miners? Like, how severe was the impact to the profitability?
Well, it just made it much easier to create a unit of Bitcoin. I mean, 50% easier. And so that drove up their margins enormously. And so that was like a truly exogenous shock. Like, people weren't really expecting that. And of course, it resulted in the destruction of property, tens of billions of dollars of Chinese miners, because frankly, not all of them could get their monies out of the country.
Yep.
A lot of them are just sitting fallow in warehouses in Malaysia and places like that. So, they weren't necessarily, as a cohort, able to plug them in elsewhere. I mean, many, like, the capacity in the US is pretty tight in terms of hosting capacity. So there just wasn't that much ability to absorb, miners from Sichuan into the US.
Yeah.
And so there was a destruction of their property. And that's unfortunately the nature of living in a, command and control economy where things can change like that.
Yeah.
But, it benefited the US miners enormously. Like a huge amount.
Let's go to the next slide. So why Texas? Is it just that, hey, they love oil and gas and they've built it out?
No, I mean, Texas has some like pretty unique features. So the governor is pro Bitcoin. Both senators are now pro Bitcoin. So we learned Ted Cruz is incredibly smart about this stuff. I don't know how he gained so much expertise in the energy grid, but he did, and it was very impressive.
Okay, so hold on. Before you go on from that, most people, I think, have this view of Ted Cruz, which we got a sense during the infrastructure bill stuff. He started to say some stuff that people were like, wait a minute, like, I agree with Ted Cruz. Like, that's not what I thought he would be his position. Then this conference, I read you transcribed some of his comments. He sounds like he's actually more informed than some people in the Bitcoin community. Like, he was pretty legit. Do we know where that came from?
I don't know, frankly. I mean, I haven't been in contact with him, to be clear. But his expertise, his level of command of the nature of ERCOT and the Texan grid and the specific interactions miners have with the grid, which I guess we can get into, was like PhD level.
Really?
And this guy has to have a position on like hundreds of different issues. So I'm like sitting there wondering, like, wait, how did he like get to that?
The thing that most people would say doesn't really matter that much, but obviously he thinks is a really big thing for Texas and the energy grid.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking that he's put so much time and effort into like really deeply understanding this. Like, what's a demand response program? What's a controllable load resource? Like, how does the supply demand balancing operate on a grid? How do the miners, come into that? He understands all that stuff. And so I was pretty shocked by that. I spent years trying to figure it out. And Ted, just like coasts to the front of the pack.
All right. So deregulated grid with real-time spot pricing. It kind of walk us through like, why is Texas so suitable?
Yeah. So ERCOT's actually a pretty capacious grid.
Well, you keep saying ERCOT. People don't know what that is.
Sorry. ERCOT is shorthand for like the Texas grid, basically. Okay. They have a ton of excess renewables, and I have a few slides. I don't know if we're going to do the whole presentation.
We're not.
There's 30 slides. Too many.
I pump faked you. Like, we go to like slide 13, and then I just skipped like 3 other ones.
This is an important one.
Okay,
You see that wind corridor going from West Texas north to up to Canada?
Yep.
That's the best area in the U.S. to, mine your wind power, right?
Why?
Because it's windy.
Okay. Shocking. That is an amazing insight.
I know, it's really key. Don't forget that. That'll be on the test. So then we have the Southwest of America has the best solar resources, right?
Okay.
And wind and solar, like, the capacity factor is in the uptime is like kind of low for both those resources. But in West Texas, you have this conjugation of it's very windy and it's very sunny. And that means, wow, amazing like suitability for renewables. That's why 30% of the Texas grid today is renewable. And that's grown from like 5% 10 years ago. And so the problem is you've got 35 gigawatts of renewable presence on the Texan grid. And it's all in the northwest corner of Texas, but all the load, all the demand for energy is in kind of the southeast.
Yep.
Austin, Houston, Dallas. And energy doesn't travel that well. That's the thing people don't get about electricity. You can't teleport it. You have to put it in these high voltage transmission lines, right? And they only have 12 gigawatts of high voltage transmission lines from West Texas to the load centers. So those are full. And then what happens the rest of the time, and there's only 5 gigawatts of load locally in West Texas, which is mostly associated with oil extraction. So what do you do with the remaining like 15 gigs?
So time out for a second. I just want to say this so that people at home understand. Oil or wind and solar, they suck in most places because you can't do it 100% of the time.
Not remotely close to 100% of the time, 25 to 40%.
Okay. In the west part of Texas, very specifically, it's hot and sunny and it's windy. So you basically can do wind and solar much more than you can do other places. But the problem is that the people who need the electricity are far away in the other part of the state. And so the ability to transport it there, you basically can't put any more through that transportation because it's already full. And then we say, well, why don't you just use it right there on site? All of the normal uses for electricity, that's also spoken for. And so now you basically have created all this additional energy, but you don't know what to do with it.
And keep in mind, they're going to be doubling the quantity of renewable energy produced mainly in West Texas in the coming years.
This is the part of the conversation where like Bitcoin shows up with like a Superman cape and is like here to save the day because it can do what?
I mean, it can absorb that excess of stranded energy. And like if you don't use the energy, it just gets pumped into the ground, you know? And actually you see this, if you look at a map of prices in Texas, the left, you know, the western half is often negatively priced. The energy producers will pay people to take the energy away from them. And the right half, you know, is where it's actually expensive. So Bitcoin is kind of this sponge which soaks up the excess. And, you know, that's incredibly useful for these renewable producers because now they have a second buyer of energy. Initially, they just had one buyer, which was the grid, and the grid would only buy it on its own terms. Now there's a second independent, you know, uncorrelated buyer, which means they can monetize these assets at, you know, interesting times, and they have the choice who they're going to sell to. So that makes the economics of their core business much, much better. And so, you know, some people say like, okay, well, Bitcoin's not an incentive to build new renewables. You know, maybe that's fine, but like it's certainly a way to monetize existing renewables and make their payback cycles much faster. And that really matters in the energy landscape.
And it feels like we're just talking about renewables and there's persistent demand from Bitcoin, which is a huge piece of this. And that's where you're getting into, well, sometimes I actually want to sell to the Bitcoin network because I know what I'm going to get paid there. But also there may be a spike in need on the energy grid or ERCOT. And I may get paid more than I would even make with Bitcoin. And so I may offload, but I now have choice. And when I have choice, it allows me to better optimize my business based on the current factors.
Absolutely. And what's more is the miners opt into these programs where the grid operator tells them, hey, do you want to turn off your machines for a little bit so that all the power can go to households that need it the most? So when you have scarcity on the grid, the miners turn themselves off. They actually get paid to do this. And so they are not depriving anyone of energy. They are actually monetizing the energy assets most of the time, and during an energy crisis or period of scarcity, they're off. And so all of that energy goes to households and hospitals, you know, to whatever, run air conditioning. So, you know, that's a really important thing. There are formal programs on the Texas grid that miners are perfectly suitable for, and other industrial centers of load are not, because virtually nothing else can turn itself off at short notice like that. Bitcoin miners can turn themselves down or off within seconds. So they can deal with the interruptibility. Aluminum smelting, you know, factory can't, or, you know, a grain processing facility can't turn itself off. You know, commercial real estate can't just turn itself off like that. So miners are this unique flexible load that's really suitable for a grid like that, where if the grid's really in high demand, there's energy scarcity, they can just be off.
Okay, let's go to the gas flare capture. If we keep going, Matt, to next one here. Explain what gas flare capture is and why this is so powerful for the miners and also from an environment standpoint.
So this is truly off-grid mining. So in the case of mitigating flared gas, you're actually just not on the grid at all. And so the way oil extraction works is whenever you get oil out of the well, it comes up in a mixture of oil and gas. So you're actually not just getting oil, you're getting oil and gas. Oil is the thing you want. Gas is generally treated as kind of a waste product. And oftentimes with a lot of these wells, you're not connected to pipelines. So you don't have a way to take the gas away. There's no economic use for it. So what they actually do is, because methane is pretty bad for the environment, they combust it, which has the output of carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is what is released post-combustion. So that's the flaring. Like, you know, if you look at an image of like oil derricks, like you'll see the flares, right? The flaring is like pretty inefficient, doesn't burn that well. Some of the methane isn't combusted. So what the miners do instead is they take this waste product, natural gas, they put it in a generator, and they burn it in a more complete combustion process, and they mine Bitcoin with the electricity. And so like that is a dramatic improvement over the status quo. And so people look at this and they don't like it because, you know, they see miners that are using natural gas. But the thing to understand is the natural gas was going to be combusted anyway. There was no economic use for it on site. There was no way to get it to a market, right? It just wasn't worth it. Natural gas is pretty cheap in the US, really, really cheap. So it's not worth building a pipeline infrastructure to take it away. And I guess the other last thing to note is like when you do what's called initial production on an oil well, so you sort of initially start it up, there's oftentimes like a 6-month burst of natural gas. And there typically wouldn't be the ability to, you know, accommodate that gas and get it to market. So the Bitcoin miners in this case come in, take advantage of that, and, you know, they might leave in 6 months' time. So it's a remarkably like flexible and, you know, potentially short-term relationship.
Most of the companies I know that are doing this are Bitcoin mining companies going to the gas flare companies, the companies that are flaring gas. Have we seen the reverse? Have we seen any of those companies say, hey, why don't we just become the experts and like vertically integrate?
Yeah. So I believe Upstream Data do not actually do the mining themselves. They create the gensets and the units for energy asset owners to mine themselves on a proprietary basis. So I think you'll see more of this too, frankly. I think we're going to see in the next few months energy companies actually get into this space on a primary basis as opposed to contracting out with miners.
Agreed. And if we go to this slide right here, we're talking about the gas flare carbon negative. This to me puts us into the realm of Bitcoin is preventing climate change. Is it solving climate change? Is it having a hand in presenting a solution or a potential solution? Like, how do you think about Bitcoin, gas flare capture, and then this whole climate change debate and kind of effort that's underway?
I mean, it's certainly in the context of the flare gas mitigation is making climate change no worse.
Okay. So it's not contributing more to the problem at a minimum.
Because the gas is flared regardless. That's just a byproduct of hydrocarbon extraction. And we still need oil for cars and airplanes and boats and things like that. So we're not going to be able to wean ourselves off of that anytime soon. So during this transition phase where we still use hydrocarbons, you know, there's going to be this externality of natural gas that's unquestionable. The miners can deal with it in a way that has a lighter climate impact than the default way, which is flaring or venting, frankly. And if you're flaring on a windy day, most of it's vented anyway. So by controlling the reaction, by coming and piping the oil into a generator and, you know, combusting it in a more controlled way, you're mitigating the emissions. That's the chart I have here with Crusoe energy. And so, you know, that's a net improvement.
For sure. I'm going to let my brothers ask questions about mining in a second. But if you have to think about how important this is for the United States moving forward, what we see going on in Texas obviously is pretty impactful. Is this something where other states and cities will start to replicate this in a material way? Or is it specific to that environment because Texas has the renewables, it has the kind of energy grid aspects that we've been talking about?
No, I mean, I think we're going to see it being relevant for nuclear. We're already seeing nuclear providers partnering up with Bitcoin miners because, again, just having an uncorrelated buyer improves your core economics. And, nuclear runs all the time, but the grid demand is like a sine wave, right? And so at night, energy might be really cheaply priced. And so what if you could monetize your nuclear output at night by selling to Bitcoin instead of selling to the grid? And that would improve your economics, that would improve your payback periods. That might give you a better incentive to build more nuclear. So it goes far beyond just wind and solar. We know Bitcoin is mined with hydro as well. But yeah, it's a pressure. It's an economic pressure on the grid, which I think liberates some of these like stranded or underutilized assets.